In July 1943, when Canadian forces landed on the Sicilian beaches near Pacino, no one imagined that these soldiers, coming from the plains and forests of Canada, would be mistaken by the Germans for elite mountain troops. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces in Italy, reported to his superiors that his troops were facing highly trained mountain warfare soldiers, the so-called Mountain Boys of the 1st Canadian Division. The irony was devastating. The Canadians possessed no specialized alpine combat training, while on the other side of the line, the Italians maintained the Alpini, the oldest active mountain infantry unit in continuous operation in the world, established in 1872. During the Italian campaign, from July 1943 to February 1945, the Canadians advanced 240 kilometers through Sicilian mountainous territory, more than any other formation of the British Eighth Army. Meanwhile, Italian Alpine divisions, equipped and trained specifically for mountain warfare, struggled to maintain defensive positions in terrain they had studied for decades. The German High Command repeatedly praised Canadian mountain fighting capabilities, while Italian troops, despite their specialized training, found themselves outmaneuvered in their own element. This paradox reveals a fundamental truth about warfare. Speed in mountain terrain depends less on specialized alpine training and more on tactical flexibility, combined arms coordination, and aggressive initiative. The Canadian success story in Italy's mountains wasn't written in training manuals about rope work and altitude acclimatization. It was written in doctrine that emphasized rapid decision-making, decentralized command, and the ability to adapt infantry tactics to armor support even in seemingly impossible terrain. The question isn't why Canadians moved faster than Italians through mountains. The question is why specialized mountain training became irrelevant when confronted with modern combined arms warfare. The doctrine divide. The Italian Alpini entered World War II with a doctrine refined over 70 years of mountain warfare experience. Their tactical manual, developed through campaigns in the Alps, Libya, and Albania, emphasized vertical envelopment, the use of high-ground positions, and the exploitation of terrain features for defensive advantage. Alpini battalions trained extensively in rock climbing, high-altitude combat, and the establishment of fortified mountain positions. Each soldier could navigate treacherous alpine passes, construct defensive works in rocky terrain, and survive in extreme mountain conditions. Their equipment reflected this specialization: lightweight mountain artillery, specialized winter uniforms, and pack animals trained for narrow mountain trails. The Canadian Army's doctrine in 1943 contained virtually nothing about mountain warfare. The 1st Canadian Division had trained primarily for European lowland combat, with emphasis on coordinated advances across open terrain. Their tactical manuals focused on combined arms coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery in relatively flat environments. When Canadian troops boarded ships for Sicily, their combat experience consisted of defensive operations in Britain and amphibious landing rehearsals. Not a single unit had conducted mountain warfare training. Their equipment reflected conventional warfare expectations: standard infantry weapons, medium tanks designed for European plains, and artillery pieces selected for mobility across roads and fields. Yet this apparent disadvantage concealed a critical advantage. Canadian doctrine emphasized what they called fire and movement, the constant coordination between different combat arms to maintain offensive momentum. Infantry companies trained to work closely with tank squadrons, with forward observers constantly calling in artillery support. Battalion commanders possessed authority to modify plans based on local conditions, trusting junior officers and NCOs to exploit opportunities without waiting for orders from higher command. This decentralized approach, born from British Commonwealth military tradition, created a flexible system where soldiers adapted tactics to circumstances rather than circumstances to pre-planned tactics. Italian mountain doctrine, conversely, emphasized the primacy of terrain. Alpini commanders selected positions based on topographical advantages, then defended those positions with determination. The doctrine assumed that properly positioned mountain troops, using terrain intelligently, could hold against larger forces. Offensive operations focused on infiltration through difficult terrain, using the mountains themselves as cover and concealment. This approach worked brilliantly in the Alps against Austro-Hungarian forces in World War I, where static defensive positions dominated warfare. but it proved dangerously inflexible against an enemy that refused to attack fortified positions directly. The fundamental difference emerged in how each army conceptualized the mountain battlefield. Italian doctrine treated mountains as obstacles that channeled enemy movement into predictable killing zones. Canadian doctrine treated mountains as terrain to be crossed as quickly as possible, finding routes that bypass strong points rather than assaulting them directly. When Canadians encountered a fortified Italian position on a hilltop, they didn't attack uphill into prepared defenses. Instead, infantry units found goat trails and ravines that allowed them to move around the position, while artillery and mortars suppressed the defenders. Once infantry established positions that threatened enemy supply lines or retreat routes, the fortified hilltop became untenable regardless of its defensive strength. This doctrinal difference manifested in every engagement. At Valgarnera in July 1943, Italian defenders occupied strong positions on Hill 701, overlooking the main road. According to mountain warfare doctrine, the position was nearly impregnable. Steep approaches, excellent fields of fire, and prepared defensive works. The Canadians ignored the position entirely, sending the loyal Edmonton Regiment through broken ground to the north, while the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada moved through a river valley to the south. Within 18 hours, both battalions had bypassed Hill 701 and threatened the Italian rear. The defenders, facing encirclement, abandoned their position without the Canadians firing a shot at the hill itself. Specialized mountain training had taught the Italians how to defend mountains. Canadian doctrine taught them how to ignore mountains that didn't need to be taken. The combined arms equation. On July 15, 1943, the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment encountered a seemingly impassable obstacle. A steep hillside near Grammichel, defended by Italian positions on the crest, with no road access for supporting armor. Traditional mountain warfare doctrine would call for dismounted infantry assault, accepting heavy casualties to seize the high ground. Instead, the Canadian battalion commander called for engineers and tank support. Within 4 hours, engineers had improved a farm track sufficiently for Sherman tanks to climb the lower slopes. The tanks couldn't reach the crest, but they could position themselves at midslope, where their 75mm guns could engage Italian positions with direct fire. Infantry companies advanced under this mobile artillery support, with the tanks literally climbing beside them, firing at defensive positions as they appeared. The Italians, trained to fight infantry assaults in mountains, had no doctrine for dealing with tanks firing from slopes they supposedly couldn't climb. This improvised combined arms approach became the Canadian signature in mountain warfare. The Italian military had separated mountain warfare from armored warfare entirely. Mountains were infantry terrain where tanks couldn't operate. Canadian commanders rejected this artificial limitation. If tanks couldn't drive up a mountain road, engineers would improve the road. If no road existed, tanks would provide fire support from whatever position they could reach. If tanks absolutely couldn't get close enough, their crews would dismount and serve as additional riflemen, while their radios maintained communication with artillery batteries. The Battle for Agira in late July demonstrated this approach at operational scale. The ancient hilltop town sat atop Monte Teja, with steep approaches on all sides and fortified German and Italian positions commanding every approach route. The terrain seemed designed for defensive warfare, exactly the environment where Italian Alpini training should have provided maximum advantage. The Canadian 1st Division attacked with 3 battalions supported by 2 tank regiments, field artillery, and self-propelled anti-tank guns. The tanks couldn't climb to Agira itself, but they established firing positions at multiple points around the base of the mountain, creating a ring of mobile artillery that could engage any defensive position visible from the lower slopes. Canadian infantry advanced not in a single thrust up the obvious routes, but in multiple simultaneous probes across the entire mountain face. Each company maintained radio contact with tank commanders and artillery forward observers. When one company encountered strong resistance, supporting arms would suppress that position while adjacent companies continued advancing through areas of less resistance. The battle became a three-dimensional chess game, with Canadian units constantly shifting points of attack based on where defenders were weakest. Italian and German defenders, fighting from prepared positions with excellent fields of fire, found themselves unable to concentrate forces against any single threat, because new threats emerged constantly from unexpected directions. The key innovation was timing and coordination. Traditional mountain warfare accepted slow, methodical advances because communication in broken terrain was difficult and coordination between units often impossible. Canadians solved this problem through lavish use of radio equipment and a doctrine that pushed radio sets down to company and even platoon level. Every infantry company commander could speak directly to supporting tank commanders and artillery observers. This meant that when an opportunity emerged, an undefended ravine, a weak point in enemy lines, a moment when defenders shifted positions, Canadian forces could exploit it immediately with combined infantry, armor, and artillery action. Italian mountain units, by contrast, relied heavily on pre-planned fires and rigid defensive schemes. Artillery positions were selected based on likely enemy approach routes, with fire plans prepared in advance. This worked when enemies attacked predictably, but Canadian forces rarely attacked where expected. Their radio-coordinated flexibility meant they could shift attack axes faster than defenders could shift artillery support. By the time Italian artillery observers identified a new Canadian thrust and called for fire missions, Canadian infantry had already moved again, probing elsewhere. The tactical mathematics were brutal. A fortified Italian position with excellent fields of fire might require a 3-to-1 attacking advantage in traditional mountain warfare. But when Canadian infantry could call down artillery fire within minutes, coordinate with tank guns firing from unexpected angles, and maneuver around strong points rather than attacking them directly, the defensive advantage evaporated. Italian Alpini found themselves defending positions that Canadian forces never attacked, while Canadian infantry infiltrated through terrain the Italians had dismissed as impassable or irrelevant. Specialized mountain training meant nothing when the enemy refused to fight a mountain battle, instead fighting a combined arms engagement that happened to occur in mountains. The logistics paradox. Italian mountain doctrine recognized that supply in alpine terrain posed unique challenges. The Alpini developed elaborate systems using pack mules, specialized carrying equipment, and supply caches positioned along mountain trails. Their logistics manuals detailed the carrying capacity of various pack animals on different grades of terrain, the caloric requirements for soldiers operating at altitude, and the establishment of supply dumps that could sustain units operating far from road networks. This represented decades of institutional knowledge about mountain logistics. It was also nearly useless in Sicily and southern Italy. The fundamental assumption underlying Italian mountain logistics was that supply would flow through established mountain trails and passes, with prepared positions receiving regular resupply via known routes. Defensive positions could be stockpiled with ammunition, food, and water before combat operations began. This worked brilliantly in the Alps, where defensive lines remained relatively static and supply routes could be prepared and protected. It failed catastrophically when facing an enemy that moved too fast for supply caches to matter and constantly threatened supply routes from unexpected directions. Canadian logistics operated on entirely different principles: forward momentum and road creation. Canadian engineers didn't accept existing roads and trails as limiting factors. They built new roads, improved farm tracks to handle heavy vehicles, and constructed bridges across supposedly impassable obstacles. The Royal Canadian Engineers became as important to Canadian offensive success as infantry or armor. When the loyal Edmonton Regiment needed supply access to positions near Leonforte, engineers constructed 5 kilometers of new mountain road in 36 hours, complete with switchbacks and culverts, allowing supply trucks and ammunition carriers to reach positions that Italian planners had assumed could only be supplied by pack animal. This engineering-focused approach created a cascading advantage. Because Canadian supply moved on wheels rather than pack animals, the volume of supplies reaching forward units was dramatically higher. A mule train might deliver several hundred kilograms of supplies over a mountain trail in a day. A convoy of trucks on an engineer-built road could deliver 20 tons. This meant Canadian units could sustain higher rates of fire, carry more ammunition, and maintain offensive operations longer without pausing to accumulate supplies. The speed advantage this created was exponential. Canadian units moved faster, which allowed engineers to improve roads behind them, which allowed more supply forward, which sustained faster movement. Italian units, by contrast, found their careful supply preparations undermined by the pace of Canadian advances. Ammunition dumps prepared for static defense became liabilities when Canadian forces bypassed defensive positions, threatening supply routes. Pack animal trains moving along established trails became vulnerable to artillery fire when Canadian forward observers identified choke points. The specialized mountain logistics that should have been an Italian advantage became a weakness because it assumed a tempo of operations that Canadians refused to accept. The battle for Regalbuto illustrated this logistics paradox perfectly. Italian and German defenders occupied strong positions on hills surrounding the town, with supply routes prepared through mountain trails. Canadian forces attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, with engineers immediately beginning road construction behind advancing infantry. Within 48 hours, Canadians had built 3 separate supply routes into their forward positions, while Italian defenders were still relying on mule trains along a single mountain trail. When Canadian artillery began interdiction fire on that trail, Italian defensive positions ran low on ammunition and water. The defenders weren't defeated by superior mountain warfare skills, they were defeated by a logistics system that built infrastructure faster than they could defend territory. Canadian supply doctrine also emphasized forward distribution of ammunition and emergency rations at the platoon and company level. Rather than maintaining large supply dumps in rear areas, Canadian logistics pushed supplies forward constantly, accepting that some might be lost to enemy action but ensuring that frontline units never ran short. Italian mountain logistics, conversely, emphasized careful rationing and controlled distribution from central supply points. This made sense in static mountain defense but proved disastrous when facing an enemy that moved unpredictably and attacked from multiple directions. The ultimate irony was that Canadian forces, lacking specialized mountain supply training, developed more effective mountain supply systems than the Alpini with their 70 years of experience. The difference was philosophical. Italian mountain logistics assumed terrain-dictated supply methods. Canadian logistics assumed supply requirements dictated terrain modification. When faced with a mountain too steep for supply trucks, Italians accepted the limitation and used mules. Canadians built a road. This aggressive, engineering-focused approach to logistics sustained offensive momentum that specialized mountain supply systems couldn't match. The initiative advantage. On August 5, 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Sutcliffe of the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment received orders to advance toward Regalbuto. His battalion encountered strong German and Italian positions blocking the main approach. According to standard military procedure, Sutcliffe should have reported the situation to brigade headquarters, requested additional support, and awaited orders. Instead, he diverted his battalion onto a goat track that reconnaissance patrols had identified leading around the enemy flank. Within hours, his battalion had bypassed the defensive position entirely and was approaching Regalbuto from an unexpected direction. When brigade headquarters learned of this maneuver, Sutcliffe's decision was already producing results. Enemy forces were withdrawing to avoid encirclement. This independence of action, repeated across dozens of engagements, exemplified the Canadian approach to mountain warfare. Junior officers and NCOs possessed authority to seize opportunities without waiting for permission. Italian and German mountain defense relied on the assumption that attackers would advance methodically, allowing defenders time to identify threats and respond. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong when facing Canadian forces. Canadian battalion and company commanders operated under what they called mission command. Higher headquarters provided objectives and general guidance, but junior commanders possessed wide latitude in how they achieved those objectives. This meant that when a patrol discovered an unguarded trail or an observation post identified a gap in enemy lines, Canadian units could exploit these opportunities immediately. The German after-action reports from Sicily repeatedly expressed frustration with Canadian unpredictability. German commanders, accustomed to British forces that attacked methodically along obvious routes, found Canadians appearing from unexpected directions at unexpected times. What Germans perceived as unpredictability was actually the result of aggressive junior leadership empowered to make tactical decisions. When an Italian defensive position oriented to defend against attack from the south, Canadians would probe from the east, west, and north simultaneously, with each company commander independently seeking routes that avoided enemy strength. This initiative-focused approach created a tempo of operations that defensive forces couldn't match. In traditional mountain warfare, defenders held the initiative, they selected positions, prepared defenses, and forced attackers to come to them. Canadian operations reversed this dynamic. Defensive positions became liabilities because Canadian forces might bypass them, rendering them irrelevant. Italian and German commanders found themselves constantly reacting, repositioning forces to counter threats that emerged faster than their command systems could process information and issue orders. The battle for Monte Revisato demonstrated this initiative advantage at its most extreme. The Seaforth Highlanders of Canada received orders to probe enemy positions on the mountain. During their reconnaissance, a platoon commander named Lieutenant John Smith discovered that a supposedly impassable ravine actually contained a trail used by local shepherds. Without requesting permission, Smith led his platoon up this trail, emerging behind Italian defensive positions that faced the opposite direction. Smith's platoon captured an Italian observation post, then called in artillery fire on enemy positions they could now observe from behind. By the time battalion headquarters learned of Smith's independent action, he had created an opportunity that the entire battalion then exploited, taking the mountain with minimal casualties. This story repeated itself across the Italian campaign. Canadian soldiers at the lowest levels, corporals leading sections, lieutenants commanding platoons, made tactical decisions that in Italian or German armies would require approval from battalion or even regimental commanders. The Canadian system accepted that some of these independent decisions would fail, but trusted that the aggregate effect of constant, aggressive initiative would overwhelm defensive forces trying to coordinate responses through hierarchical command structures. Italian mountain warfare doctrine, by contrast, emphasized centralized control and careful coordination. Alpini battalion commanders selected defensive positions and assigned sectors to companies. Company commanders positioned platoons according to prepared plans. Individual soldiers executed their roles within this carefully structured system. This approach maximized the defensive strength of terrain by ensuring that every position interlocked with adjacent positions, creating mutually supporting fields of fire. But it also meant that when unexpected threats emerged, response required information to flow up the chain of command, decisions to be made at higher levels, and orders to flow back down. By the time this process completed, Canadian forces had already exploited the opportunity and moved on. The mathematical advantage of aggressive initiative was simple. Canadian forces created more tactical opportunities than Italian and German forces could counter. Every Canadian patrol that discovered a new route, every company commander who exploited a gap in enemy lines, every platoon that bypassed a strong point created a problem that defensive forces had to solve. Defenders could solve any individual problem, but they couldn't solve 20 problems simultaneously spread across 10 kilometers of front. The cumulative effect was paralysis. Defensive commanders found themselves unable to maintain coherent defensive lines because Canadian forces penetrated or bypassed those lines faster than defenders could adjust. The adaptability factor. When the Royal 22e Regiment, the Van Duce, first encountered Italian mountain positions in Sicily, their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bernatchez, gathered his company commanders and asked a simple question: what would work better than what we trained for? This question became the foundation of Canadian mountain warfare success. Unlike Italian forces bound by decades of mountain warfare doctrine, Canadian commanders approached each engagement as a unique problem requiring fresh solutions. They borrowed tactics from British commandos, studied German infiltration techniques, and invented new approaches based on immediate battlefield experience. The most dramatic example of Canadian tactical adaptation occurred during the advance to Ortona in December 1943. The loyal Edmonton Regiment encountered a series of fortified farms and stone buildings that created interlocking defensive positions. Traditional infantry tactics called for clearing buildings systematically, room by room, a slow, casualty-intensive process. Instead, Canadian engineers and infantry developed mouse-holing, a technique where explosive charges blew holes through adjacent walls, allowing infantry to move between buildings without exposing themselves to enemy fire. This technique, invented spontaneously by junior officers and NCOs, spread across the Canadian division within days. By the time the battle for Ortona itself began, Canadian infantry had refined mouse-holing into a sophisticated system that allowed them to clear fortified buildings faster than defenders could reinforce them. Italian mountain troops, equipped with excellent tactical manuals and extensive training, rarely deviated from established procedures. When a defensive position failed, they fell back to the next prepared position and repeated the same defensive tactics. Canadian forces, lacking established mountain warfare procedures, experimented constantly. Artillery observers developed new techniques for calling fire onto reverse slopes. Infantry sections modified their patrol formations for broken terrain. Tank commanders learned to position their vehicles to provide fire support from positions Italian defenders never anticipated. Each tactical innovation spread informally through the division as soldiers shared lessons learned. This adaptability extended to equipment modification. Canadian soldiers issued standard infantry weapons and equipment designed for European lowland warfare, modified everything for mountain conditions. Soldiers lightened their loads by discarding unnecessary equipment, carrying extra ammunition and water instead. Units improvised carrying frames from salvaged materials to transport heavy weapons up steep slopes. Tank crews learned to use their vehicles as mobile pillboxes when tracks couldn't navigate terrain, backing tanks into positions where their guns could fire over infantry positions. None of these modifications appeared in training manuals. They emerged from soldiers solving immediate practical problems. The contrast with Italian forces was stark. Alpini units entered combat with equipment specifically designed for mountain warfare, but they used that equipment according to established procedures. When circumstances didn't match doctrinal assumptions, Italian units struggled to adapt. Canadian forces entered combat with inappropriate equipment but adapted it constantly to meet immediate needs. The result was that Canadians, despite lacking specialized mountain gear, often functioned more effectively in mountain terrain than Italian troops with proper equipment used inflexibly. Communication systems illustrated this adaptability difference. Italian mountain units relied heavily on telephone wire for communication, appropriate for static defensive positions. When Canadian forces bypassed these positions or called artillery fire on known communication points, Italian units lost contact with higher headquarters. Canadian forces used radio communications extensively, despite radios being heavier and more temperamental than telephone systems. When radios failed in valleys or behind ridgelines, Canadian units adapted by positioning radio relay stations on high ground, creating communication networks that functioned despite terrain obstacles. The ultimate manifestation of Canadian adaptability was the speed with which they learned from mistakes. After early engagements revealed that frontal attacks on hilltop positions caused heavy casualties, Canadian tactics shifted immediately to emphasize flanking movements and infiltration. When Italian and German forces began defending likely flanking routes, Canadian forces shifted again to using multiple simultaneous probes. This tactical evolution occurred continuously throughout the campaign, with lessons from morning engagements informing afternoon attacks. Italian defensive tactics, by contrast, changed slowly, requiring formal doctrinal revision at higher command levels. By February 1945, when Canadian forces finally paused their advance, they had developed a comprehensive system of mountain warfare that bore little resemblance to their training or to Italian mountain warfare doctrine. It was a system built on aggressive initiative, combined arms coordination, engineering-supported logistics, and constant tactical adaptation. Italian Alpini, the world's premier mountain warfare specialists, had been consistently outmaneuvered by Canadian forces who treated mountains not as specialized terrain requiring specialized training, but as obstacles to be overcome through the same principles that guided their warfare anywhere: speed, flexibility, and the aggressive application of combined arms.